Well, hello and welcome, and it's great to be back with another production. And this one is going to be quite special because this year, 2022, is the 1900th anniversary of the start of the building of Hadrian's Wall. This wasn't the only wall that Hadrian built. He built walls all over the Roman Empire, and you'll find out shortly why that was. And historians amongst you will know that this wasn't the only Roman wall in Britain. There were others, but without doubt this was by far the most famous and well known. It's going to be a very busy year up here on the wall, so if you're planning your staycation for this year, be sure to include Hadrian's Wall in your itinerary. For this production, I'm going to be working with a co-presenter, Anna Gray from Discover Lakeland Guided Tours. She will be presenting the west section of the wall from Bowness on Solway to Chester's Bridge, and I will be covering the area from Chester's to here in Newcastle. Before we begin this journey along Hadrian's Wall, I would just like to paint some background for those of you who are not familiar with the history of the wall. The emperors of Rome prior to Hadrian were intent on expanding the Roman Empire wherever possible. When Hadrian came to power, he broke that tradition and saw consolidation of the empire as his goal. Whereas his predecessors had relied on reports from their generals about the state of the empire, Hadrian was more about seeing for himself and spent most of his reign travelling the empire. He came to power in 117 AD and visited Britain in 122 AD. Primarily to inspect the progress on the building of the wall, planned and initiated by him sometime before 122. The construction of the wall between Newcastle in the east and Bowness on Solway to the west was to act as a frontier between the Roman-held area of Britain and the Celtic north. Although it acted primarily as a defensive structure to deter any possible invasions or thoughts of invasions, it was also a border frontier, allowing traders to pass through at control points and pay taxes to Rome. A common misunderstanding is that the building work began in Wallsend in the east and progressed west along the wall to Bowness, but as you will learn, that is not the case. Building was carried out all along the 80 Roman miles simultaneously by numerous cohorts of workers, and it must have been quite a spectacle. Usually visitors to the wall travel east to west. We will be going west to east, and we begin here at Bowness on Solway.
We're at the very end, or possibly the very start of Hadrian's Wall here. Just behind me we have this construction called the Banks at Bowness on Solway, and this is where Hadrian's Wall is coming out of the fort of Maya, just a bit further in front of me there, and then it's continuing in an easterly direction behind me all the way to Wallsend, a distance of 80 Roman miles, which equates to about 72, 73 English miles. And the wall, it wasn't just a wall. Every Roman mile there was something called a mile castle, which is like a small fortlet, and then between those fortlets there were two turrets. So the pattern was mile castle, turret, turret, mile castle, turret, turret, all the way along the wall. And although the wall actually ended here at Maya, the system of fortifications of mile fortlets and turrets did continue further to the west, going round the whole headland, around towards Maryport and beyond Maryport. However, these turrets and mile castles were not connected by a wall. So a bit further to the west is the Roman fort of Maya, which is one of the largest on the wall. And it's here on a headland just to guard the crossing point. There was actually a ford, if you like, at low tide from this point here across to the far shore, which is actually southern Scotland there. So the fort was built here to guard that crossing point. Well, hello, here we are at Banks Turret, which is turret 52A. And this is where we're going to start our exploration of Hadrian's Wall from this point here, heading eastwards here. So we've got a wonderful section of wall here. It's an original form, and behind me there is a turret. So I'm just going to at this point explain a little bit about why Hadrian's Wall was built, who built it, and how it operated. Hadrian's Wall was built in AD 122 under the orders of Emperor Hadrian. Hadrian had inherited a vastly enlarged empire, and he had no wish to actually extend that any further. He wanted to consolidate the gains that had been made. So, as a result of problems with the barbarians to the north of where we are and other problems, he decided he was going to put a wall in running from the Solway Firth, Bowness, essentially over in the west, across to Wallsend in the east. Hadrian's Wall just took 6 years to complete, which is a phenomenal undertaking when you consider its width and its length. The length is actually about 72 miles, which equates to 80 Roman miles, and we'll come back to that in a moment or so. So when it was conceived as a wall, it wasn't ever meant to be a solid barrier. It's more meant to act as a frontier zone. Now, I'm going to explain to you the system of fortifications along Hadrian's Wall. Remember that the wall was actually 80 Roman miles, which is slightly shorter than an English mile. So 80 Roman miles equates to roughly about 72 English miles. And the Romans are putting in a mile castle every Roman mile. And between those mile castles, they're putting in 2 turrets. So the whole pattern on the wall is mile castle, turret, turret, mile castle, turret, turret, mile castle, and so on. So here we are at turret 52A. Now this tells us, given that the numbering system starts in the east and ends in the west, that we are 52 and a bit Roman miles from Wallsend over in the east, and that we've got nearly another 28 miles to get to Bowness in the west. I'm just in the doorway of turret 52A, and it's a sort of a square-built, smallish structure, essentially acting as a sort of a lookout point along the wall. And if you just look through inside, you'll see there are 2 raised hearths at the back. These would have been to keep the soldiers warm. You probably would have had about 2 stories above my head, and with a third one opening up onto a platform at the top as a lookout. And each of those levels would have been connected by a wooden ladder. You may ask why Hadrian's Wall is here at all. Well, it's here for 3 main reasons. 1, it's running across the narrowest part of the country. 2 is that it had to be north of Alston Moor, which is over on my right-hand side. Alston Moor was a very lead-rich area, and the Romans knew that. And so they came to exploit the lead, the silver and the zinc from that site, and even put a fort known as Epiarchum on the top of Alston Moor to guard those mines. So Hadrian's Wall needed to be to the north of that. And the third reason is that it was going to exploit a natural geological feature called the Wind Sill, which we'll see later on our tour. Here we are, I'm standing right next to Hadrian's Wall here, and you can see it is remarkably wide. It is about at least 8 foot, maybe up to 10 foot in places. And you might ask the question, why is it as wide as this? Well, the reason is that it probably carried a walkway. So imagine on this side, it's up to about at least 10 foot high, and on the far side, up to 15 foot high. And the 2 edges were connected by this walkway. So that, it must have been quite a substantial feature to see in the landscape at this height. Well, we looked at the structure of Hadrian's Wall along its length, so now let's turn our attention to the structure across the Hadrian's Wall. So I'm going to show you this cross-section here, and it's aligned as you see it actually in the video here. So we've got Hadrian's Wall here, there, with the higher side to the north and the slightly lower side to the south, with a walkway between the two. But to the north of us, there is a V-shaped ditch, which you can see in this illustration here. And that is going to be very prominent as we actually journey from here across to the east. Often we'll see that ditch and we won't see the wall. And it's interesting to think that the inverse structure has survived for longer than the actual upstanding wall itself. So these two were built at the same time. And you might also notice a bit of a flat area, roughly where the road is, between the wall and the ditch. And that, in the lowland areas, often found to have post holes in it. And so there may have been a thicket of sharpened staves in here, if not pits containing sharpened staves in this location here. So after the wall and the ditch were completed in around about 128 AD, the Romans decided to put in a southern defence, which is called the Vallum here. And the Vallum is quite an astonishing structure. It consists of a deep central ditch, 2 berms on either side and 2 embankments, and it can be quite wide. Its location to the wall can vary. Sometimes it runs more or less parallel to the wall and very close to it, and other times it's further away just to avoid an obstacle like a bog or a rocky hillock or something like that. So we have now, instead of having just a wall and a ditch, we now have a military zone. And the last feature to go in is the military road. Now this was a road that was put in to service the backs of the mile castles, and it ran between the Vallum and the wall here. And because it's a road, it's quite hard to identify that, but you can make out parts of it along the length of Hadrian's Wall. Earlier on I mentioned that the next structure behind me to the east would be Mile Castle 52. That is not quite strictly true, because at the top of that small rise is actually the base of a signal tower. Now this predates Hadrian's Wall. It was installed at the time when the Stone Gate was built, and the Stone Gate was the earlier Roman frontier, a Roman road, and that signal tower acted as a lookout for the Stone Gate. When Hadrian's Wall was built, the signal tower was incorporated into the line of the wall, but at 45 degrees. Well, we're at our next visible structure along Hadrian's Wall. This is turret 51B. We actually went past the site of the Mile Castle 52, but there's nothing to be seen of that. But this is the next structure we come to. And further to the east, we'll also come across turret 51A, which is about 1/3 of a mile. So very, very similar to the last turret we were at, which was 52A, square, raised hearth in the centre, more or less the same dimensions. And if you look, you can see the ditch behind this turret, and the field wall there is in line with Hadrian's Wall, so it's coming in and abutting this turret, this side and also on the far side. I'm now sitting inside turret 51A, and we've come approximately about 1/3 of a mile from 51B, which is the previous turret we stopped at. And again, just like the previous one, same shape, door still in the same place, raised hearth at the back. It still has all the elements that the other turrets have had. But I need to say that at this point, when the wall was actually built here, there was not enough stone, and so they built the wall out of turf. But the turrets and the mile castles were built in stone from the outset. And the proof of that is just over on this side of the turret here. Well, this line you can see here is where Hadrian's Wall, the stone Hadrian's Wall, is abutting the turret here. Now remember, the turret was built in stone from the outset. The wall was built out of turf initially and then replaced in stone. So this came at a later stage and was abutting the existing structure here. And our next stop, we're going to see where the stone and the turf walls diverge. So that will be our next stop. I'm standing in the platform of Mile Castle 51, which has been almost entirely robbed away. You can probably just make out some of the mounds, which are probably covering the stone walls, but most of it is gone. So Mile Castle 51, another 1/3 of a mile from turret 51A, which we saw earlier on. Mile Castle 51 is quite an interesting site because behind me, this is where the stone wall and the turf wall diverge, or you could argue converge, whichever way you look at it. So it's at this point here that the stone wall was, when they rebuilt the turf wall in stone, they didn't do that in this place. For some reason they decided to place the stone wall a little to the north of the turf wall. And so behind me you can see a ditch, which is the north ditch of the turf wall, with the turf wall just to the south of that. Well, from this section here, we have the two lines. We have the turf wall and the stone wall running parallel to each other and not actually coming back together again until we get to Harrow Scar, which is to the east of Bird Oswald. And both the turf wall and the stone wall have their own turrets, so it would be the turf wall turrets and the stone wall turrets, and the stone wall mile castles and the turf wall mile castle. Well, hello again, and here we are at Bird Oswald this time, and I'm standing outside the east gate of Bird Oswald here, and this is probably the finest example of a gateway in any fort along Hadrian's Wall. So you can see that it's a double arched entrance, and each entrance originally would have had two doors opening inwards here. However, at some point the northern gateway was blocked up to create a second guard room here. And it's on this line that the turf wall originally passed through this fort here. If you remember when we were at Wall Bowers, we discussed about the divergence of the stone wall and the turf wall. And the divergence happened because the stone wall needed to move to the north. And here we are, the turf wall came through the middle of Bird Oswald and continues in an easterly direction. And the stone wall now goes to the north. So that's what we've got here. And I'm going to compare this particular image with one that was an engraving that was done in 1852, and you'll see that the two views have hardly changed at all. So you'll see behind me, you'll see the base stone forming the bottom part of the arch of the northern gateway here, and that is the only example that there is along the wall in one of the forts. Well, here we have a particularly fine example of a drainage channel, and that was put in by the Romans because presumably this area here was quite boggy, quite wet, and they needed to drain it away from the wall. Hence why it's here. Well, we're here at just to the east of Bird Oswald, and it's a particularly fine section of continuous original wall here. And this wall is continuous to Harrow Scar Mile Castle, which is where we're going to be going in a short while. But it contains two features of interest, one of which is more or less directly opposite where I'm standing. And here, built into the wall, is a very fine phallic symbol here. And you may wonder why such a thing actually is on the wall, and it's because the soldiers regarded the phallus as protection against the evil eye, and the evil eye represents all sorts of dangers that there might be out there beyond the wall. And you can see this one is actually on the southern side of the wall, and the dangers would be to the north beyond here. And in fact, this is not the only phallic symbol on this section. There is another one further down which we'll also see. So we could regard this as sort of the willy walk along the wall. Well, here we are at our second phallic symbol. Here it is, here, and it's pointing the same way as the other one, i.e. to the west. We're here at Mile Castle 49, otherwise known as Harrow Scar. And this is, you can see I'm standing on the wide width of the western wall of the Mile Castle, wide because it would have taken a walkway around the inside of the Mile Castle itself. But the rest of it has been knocked about a bit. You'll see there's a farm track coming right through it, and the remains behind me are of a later building. So it's not the best example of a Mile Castle that I can show you. However, it does demonstrate one interesting thing, and that's if we look westwards, you'll see that the wall is going straight, and then suddenly the wall begins to deviate towards the north. And that is because it's at this point where the turf wall and the stone wall deviate once again. We saw that at Wall Bowers, and here's the other end of it. So originally, the wall here would have been built on top of the turf wall. The turf wall then continued in a straight line, heading towards that east gateway that we saw at Bird Oswald. And then you'll also see that the stone wall then begins to deviate away, so that it's actually then making contact with the north wall of the fort itself. I'm standing in the southern entrance or exit from the Mile Castle here, and people would pass through and then descend a steep slope in order to go down into the valley of the River Irthing, and that's exactly where we're going to go next, except we're not going to follow this route, we're going to follow the farm track to get there. Well, I'm just standing on the edge of the Willowford Bridge here, a modern bridge which goes over the River Irthing. It was installed in 1999 and had to be sort of airlifted into place section by section by helicopter. And it's a very fine piece of engineering, and we get a better view of it from the other side of the river. Well, from this very fine modern structure that we've just walked over, we're just going to walk on a few hundred yards to get to something that's much older than this. I'm just standing on the pier of the Roman bridge here at Willowford. We just crossed over a modern bridge, and here we are at this bridge, which was constructed about 1900 years ago when the wall was being built. And back in that day, there would have been water rushing through on either side. I would have been surrounded by water, but there's no water now. This bridge is isolated inland because the river has moved to the west, leaving these bridge abutments just isolated on dry land. There have been 3 bridges in this location over the Roman period of time, and the first one was just a simple bridge that was carrying the wall over the River Irthing with a turret at either side, and one of those turrets was probably in the area that I'm actually standing in here. The second bridge was possibly a timber constructed bridge rather than the stone bridge of the first one, and this time they move the tower further in. You can see this structure here with the central pillar is probably where that turret was. And this time we have a bridge supported by wooden struts, which we'll see in a moment. And we've also got the 2 sluices that were inserted at that point, probably because there might have been a mill here or possibly a smithy, both of which would have needed water nearby. The third phase of development here was necessary in order to carry the military road over the river, and that necessitated widening the bridge. So the military road came up here, so they basically demolished this turret to bring the military road up on a ramp here, adjacent to the wall, and then across the river that way. Right, I'm here to look at some of the detail of the second bridge, the one that had the timber construction. Because here you'll see a square socket hole here, and there's another one there. And they would have held square supports, posts, that would then have in themselves supported sort of a trellis system to carry the wall over the river here. And there's also other features of interest. You'll see on this far side, this triangular shape here. That matches another one on this side, and that would again probably been where sort of triangular supports would have been put through here. And on the top you'll see we've got these sort of wedge-shaped depressions here, and there's several of those. There's another one there, and they were probably another one here in fact, though missing on this one here. And they would have been where the masons would have cut these. I believe they're called masons' dogs, but don't quote me on that. They would have been filled with sort of molten lead or molten iron to bind the stones together to keep them in place. And the third feature we've got of interest here is this slit here. Now this is a Lewis hole, and it was cut by the stonemasons either to lift a block of stone out of a quarry or to actually put it into position. So what the masons would do, they'd cut this slit, this wedge, and it's angled backwards on either side. You can see my fingers going in at an angle like that. And this was designed to take something called a Lewis key. Now a Lewis key had 3 parts to it. The 2 outer parts were shaped like a wedge and the central one was straight. So you put the 2 outer pieces in first with the wedge shape, and then you drive down the central one and it forces the 2 wedge shapes to either side. So now you created a lock. And then from the Lewis key, then you attach it to a hoist, and you're ready then using a crane to actually lever this piece of stone into position. And that's how the Romans actually, in this particular instance, got these stones into where they were needed. The wall was built in sections by cohorts of men, all working at the same time. And every now and then what you get is a centurial stone built into the wall, which records that particular cohort or century of men actually constructed that section of the wall. Now these are highly prized, and they often find their way into other buildings, as is the case here. So if you just look here, this is a centurial stone right there. And it actually says it is the 5th cohort from the century of Gellius Philippus, who built that particular section. So in a way, it's accountability. He's actually saying to the general of Britain, or even the emperor himself, which actual person was in charge of building that section of wall. I'm standing within turret 48B, and in effect this is about 1/3 of a mile from Harriscar Mile Castle, which is over on the west side there. And this is a section of wall where we get a mile castle and 2 turrets and another mile castle all within the same section, and that's quite a rare thing to find on the wall. I'm at the far side of the turret here, on the eastern side, and this here is what we call the wing wall to do with that turret. But here, the bit I'm standing on, you'll see I'm standing on a low structure here. Now, what's happened here, what we've got here are the foundation stones, which run the full width of the wall. And then we get the wall, which has been set back. Now, this is because Hadrian came to inspect progress on the wall around about 122 AD, and he thought work was progressing too slowly, and then ordered that the wall be narrowed in order to quicken the whole process up. So here we have, the foundation stones were laid down first, but he's ordered the wall to be built back from that. So in this instance, we're getting narrow wall on the broad foundation. I'm standing outside turret 48A, which is the next turret in our sequence. Remember, we went to Harriscar Mile Castle, which is Mile Castle 49, and then turret 48B, this is turret 48A, and our next stop will be at Mile Castle 48, otherwise known as Poltross Burn. And that will complete our sequence of Mile Castle, turret, Mile Castle, all of which are visible and remain to this day. I'm standing in the southern gateway of Poltross Burn Mile Castle, which is Mile Castle number 48. And it's a large Mile Castle, this one, and quite well preserved. And it's got a couple of features of interest, which we'll talk about in a moment. But just to say here, we've got the south entrance, which has been partly blocked up, and behind me are 2 rows of barracks with a central sort of roadway between them. So goods and people will be passing through from underneath the the gateway with the tower on top, through the central and through the southern gateway, and then over the vallum. Well, behind me you can see there are 2 rows of barracks, and they would have probably housed about up to 30 men here. And between the barracks there is a central roadway, and this would be the way by which people and their goods would be passing through this Mile Castle from one side of the wall to the other. And on that way through they will be searched, they'll be vetted, they will be taxed, any goods they were bringing through, by the soldiers, and then they would proceed through the south gateway over the vallum, and then they were free. So here we have a series of ovens here built into the northwest corner of this Mile Castle. You can see the first one here, and then there are layers of ovens on top of that. So this is unusually actually where soldiers will be baking their bread and cooking various items. Often these ovens though are outside the Mile Castle for fear of fire, whereas here it's actually inside the Mile Castle. Well, here we have an unusual feature. We've got a series of steps here. And they think that these would have led up onto the walkway, which had been all the way around the inside of this Mile Castle. And from these few steps here, they can extrapolate and work out that that walkway is probably about 12 foot high where the steps ended. Well, this is where we're going to end our day, exploring this section of wall between Birdoswald and Poltross Burn. So please join us next time when we're going to go to the Wartown Crags and have a look at what we can find there.
Well, that concludes part one of this journey along Hadrian's Wall in this celebration year. I've deliberately split the film up into 3 parts, more watchable sections if you like, but if you want to watch the full film in its entirety, that is also posted on this channel. If you haven't already done so, please subscribe, switch on the notifications so that you're always up to date with the latest releases, and give us a like. Next, we're going to look at the central section of the wall, so I'll look forward to seeing you for that.